Hey, it's me, Editor Dalton. Before this episode starts, I just wanted to let you know that I had a lot of technical issues while I was recording this, so there may be moments where Professor Signor either repeats the same thing twice or she'll pivot ideas mid sentence. She's not going crazy. I just had to cut out the parts where I was fixing the technical issues. Okay, enjoy the episode. Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is the final episode of podcast Ear Openers. Today I'm with Professor Signor, who runs the very successful ISU trumpet studio, and she also conducts the ISU jazz band. So how are you doing today?
Hanging in there, sir.
Yeah.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So today we're kind of going to do like a brief overview of everything jazz, and we'll just start off with a little bit of history. So kind of when and where did jazz begin to form as a genre?
So most of the time when we talk about the history of jazz, we talk about New Orleans. And if we think about the history and origins of jazz, it's really a multicultural music that has had roots in many places, but we think of it as being quintessentially American and residing primarily in New Orleans. It is a melding of several different cultural musics. So we've got the Pan-African diaspora that was brought over during the slave trade, the Afro-Caribbean influences, so Puerto Rico, Cuba, all of those countries and provinces, and a whole bunch of migrants and refugees from other countries that came to America to find their way in the world. And most of that all sort of happened in New Orleans. So it was the most major hub of America around the turn of the century. The history of jazz is hard to trace because so much of it was not recorded.
It's a very hard question.
No. I love the delving into it though. We think of combo jazz and small group jazz as being sort of conceived around the turn of the century. The first jazz recording was they were made in 1917 and 1918, and our American jazz recording, like the one that everybody knows, is the original Dixieland Jazz Band. Mm-hmm. And jazz was the music of the underground. It was the music of the people. Like the folks with the money were not listening to jazz. It was the folks that were working and wanted to just like cut loose after being in the field or doing whatever they were doing. So jazz is found in speakeasies, and it's controversial. It's very sexy. Most of the songs are about taboo subjects, and some of them are more taboo than others. But ultimately, it's feel-good music. It is absolutely feel-good music. It's music meant to take your mind off your troubles and sort of illustrate that, like, yeah, you're not alone. We're all in this together. We all have crappy days in our lives. It's okay, that kind of stuff. What's interesting to me about the history of jazz as a genre is that if you think about like the canon of Western music in general being, about what do we figure, about 650 years thereabouts?
Okay. A long time.
Yeah. And so we can view in sort of a macro lens, all of the different harmonic changes and cultural changes which brought about musical changes throughout the course of history with the common practice, prior to the common practice, Gregorian chant, church music, all of that stuff. And we can watch how these patterns change over time very, very slowly. But what's cool about jazz is that it's done all that same stuff, but in like 100 years.
Yeah. That's a really good point.
So yeah. And much of my research is centered around post-World War II era jazz, so big band jazz. But big band jazz is born of the small group jazz tradition, the riff song tradition, the blues tradition. And like all of those things find themselves coming from field hollers, Pan-African traditional music, and all things that were essentially just ignored by the powers that be. And in many ways, jazz is the American shout, the American fist in the air saying, "We will not be forgotten. You cannot keep us under your boot forever. Dang it!" And I love that about this music. It's it's protest music, even in its most peaceful form. It's protest music. So does that answer your question? I mean, I could go on, but
no, that's great. And I think you're so right. It's really hard to pinpoint like when and where jazz formed as a genre, because so much contributed to it.
Exactly.
It's really hard to be like, okay, definitively on this date someone's like, this is jazz, because it's kind of just an amalgamation. Yeah.
No, I mean, and no one in Western music history says, oh, well, on December 7th, 1750, Baroque music was born, or classical music was born. No one does that. And similarly, they don't do that for jazz either. The one of the many interesting aspects about the formation of jazz as a genre is that it has so many tributaries. So if you go back and you try to trace the origins of the blues, or the origins of rhythm and blues, the origins of Latin music, salsa music, like Latin jazz has like incredible roots that span through Central and South America as well. So it's never a dull subject. There's always something cool to learn, always an artist that maybe you've never heard of. And so the more you get into just going down those little rabbit holes, the more interesting it gets.
Yeah. So how do you think in the 1920s to 30s, jazz changed from the 1910s and those styles? How did we kind of evolve?
Yeah. So the 20s were all about like partying and having a good time, the roaring 20s, which was ironic because of the whole, Great Depression thing. But that's sort of the vibe of jazz in general. Like we take the dichotomy of the things that are the worst about life, and then we say, all right, that's all terrible, but we're gonna celebrate this other stuff and have a good time, because why not? We're alive, we should do that. So jazz was used as dance music and parade music, and it was a social construct. You go out and, that's how people would socialize. I don't think that changed drastically from the 10s to the 20s. I think the activities surrounding jazz were essentially the same: dancing, socializing, cavorting. But I think there was an added level of dangerousness, which is where the connotation of jazz being the devil's music sort of comes from. So much so that it was outlawed in like several countries in the world. Like prior to World War I, jazz had been outlawed in Germany, Russia. Like, I mean, so much of the what we would say like Eastern European or Western European world, it was taboo. No one wanted to do it because it was dangerous. Well, it was associated with being dangerous because people would be rolling up in speakeasies, drinking illegal booze, and listening to jazz. It's not that the jazz music was the problem. It was, people breaking the rules. Which, I mean, I guess culturally, if you think about it, breaking the rules is sort of one of the backbones of jazz. It's just like, oh, okay, we're gonna take these established status quo, and we're just gonna challenge them. And that's what makes the music interesting. I often tell my students about a story post 1957 when bebop was really starting to be a thing. And bebop was invented to ostracize people. Bebop was invented to make people really uncomfortable. And similarly, jazz was there to make people uncomfortable and to challenge what was, typically accepted to be, like the social standard of polite music. In other aspects, in other social situations, parlor music was being played, like cutesy little tunes that were being very clever about the way they were covering up the messages about sex and drugs and things that people have been doing and being a part of for time immemorial. But jazz was just overt about that. It's just like, okay, you got like, we're just going to talk about being human beings now, and human beings have these like little naughty things they want to go be doing, and we're going to sing about it. And there was no veil. So jazz got this reputation in the world as being taboo and scary and dangerous and insidious. You would take the most innocent of minds and corrupt them.
I think I saw when I was doing the research for this episode, I read, I forget the critic's name, but they described, jazz as just a the devil's music that won't last longer than 15 years, which I'll say has got to be one of the like poorest like age takes I've ever heard, with how
It's
how
so
it is
true.
incredibly wrong. A person
Oh,
was.
absolutely. The nature of America is rebellion. That's why we're a freaking country. Like, we basically said to Britain, we don't like your rules. We're out of here. Bye. And so to think that jazz is anything more or less than us rebellious Americans being rebellious Americans is a little heavy-handed.
Yeah.
The notion that it would even go away is like so ill-founded.
Yeah. So we'll move on to the 1940s and 50s, and we kind of briefly touched on bebop. But so how did jazz kind of evolve in this time, and how did World War II affect the genre?
Okay. So as stated, I could go on forever and ever and ever about this particular era of jazz, because that is where the bulk of my research has lain rather. So post World War II, the country was in a bit of a state of disarray, right? We've got all of these men that were sent off to Europe to go fight a war that they were pretty well behind. I think everybody wanted to kill Nazis. Well, maybe that's heavy-handed. The Nazis probably didn't want to kill Nazis, but the Americans did. And so we had, thousands of men primarily, and some female, nurses and that sort of thing, overseas. Homes were broken. The economy was rough, but not impossibly broken. We actually had, this is a lesser known part of history, the women, like, we talk a lot about the Industrial Revolution being sort of held up by women because all of the men were off at war and women were taking industrial jobs. So too was the music industry. So when everyone was off at war, there were these territorial or regional jazz orchestras, any of those pieces written in a decade or so. And of big band music was so that people could go out and dance, forget their troubles, rub and touch with their sweetie on the dance floor, and maybe think about a new beginning, think about a new future. Another thing that changed the way jazz was perpetuated and perceived in the 40s was, really pivotal in the establishment of the art, was the addition of radio. Everybody was listening to the radio for their entertainment. Everybody was listening to the radio for their news. That was one of the main sources of entertainment, especially in rural areas where there weren't, these big, musical ensembles or big halls for the musical ensembles to play in. And so unfortunately, what had happened to big band jazz, which, you can look, there are, dozens, if not hundreds, of historical accounts of all black bands, like all mulatto bands, mixed bands playing this music. But when radio came around, the only people that had access to anybody in radio were white people. And so big band jazz became, for lack of better expression, really whitewashed in the early mid 40s. And so when you go back and you look at the music and the way it was written and the way it was played, we have a man called Paul Whiteman to thank for that. But in that so Paul Whiteman basically appropriated big band jazz and said, oh, look, we're going to do radio big band jazz. We're going to do it our way, the American way. And the American way was to appropriate in, completely just disregard the rights and authorship of the musicians of color who perpetuated music. Similarly, I don't feel like Glenn Miller was so much this way, but Glenn Miller, Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey, all of our white band leaders, if you look back at history, it's not that they were meaning to be culturally inappropriate, because the concept really hadn't been thought about. People of color didn't have rights. Oh, of course we can take their music and do what we want with it. We know now that that's wrong, but at the time, I don't genuinely think those people thought they were doing something wrong.
It wasn't malicious.
Exactly. Culturally speaking, I think what they thought they were doing was a service to the community, in that they were keeping people's minds off their troubles. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So essentially what had happened was like two factions of big band jazz sort of emerged. There was like sort of the authentic speakeasy jazz played by people of color that you would hear in dance halls, not on the radio. You would hear it live, you would hear it in tents, you would hear it, any place where live music was had. And then you had white people jazz that was heard on the radio.
Yeah.
And it has a very different time feel, if we want to talk a little bit about the technical aspects of the difference between the radio jazz and the more like grassroots big band jazz, a lot of it has to do with the type of swing. In radio jazz, you have an exaggeration of a dotted 8/16 rhythm, da 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 da. When you're talking about live grassroots, jazz made primarily by people of color, it has a more 6/8 feel. Do va do va do va do va do va do, essentially the same rhythm, just a little bit more smooth. But that's one of the ways as a listener that we can sort of get an idea of who wrote it and when they wrote it, is like, how are they swinging? How are they syncopating? The whole notion of syncopation, I didn't even touch on that in the 20s. The whole notion of syncopation was in itself like very groundbreaking and taboo, because prior to that, everything had either been on the beat or off the beat, not off the beat in sequence. No, we can't have that. It's terribly feisty and dangerous. But that's one of the principles that on which jazz is essentially based, is syncopation, and the notion that the eighth note, the subdivision of the time, will swing. It'll be a little lopsided, heavy on one side, light on the other.
Yeah, there's a lot of good points there. I think you're very right with, it's so hard to talk about everything, like completely miss syncopation, just because there's so much about jazz. It's such a broad thing.
Yes and no. I think for me personally, it's a matter of projection bias. I forget often that not everyone has taken or been exposed to the amount of big band jazz or jazz in general that I have. And so I go, oh, of course they know about syncopation. It's just me being like, oh, wait a minute. No, they might not know. Let me tell them. And I do that in class sometimes too. Like I'll reference some like very specific thing about the type of swing, involved in like Sinatra versus Ellington or something. And I'll get like deer in headlights from the band. And I'm like, oh, wait a minute. Okay, hang on. I got to explain the historical context of this, and it'll make more sense once I do. So there was that. But yeah, jazz was for dancing. Jazz was for feeling good and taking your mind off your troubles. And the radio spread jazz across the country like wildfire. So now our centers of jazz stopped being primarily New Orleans, and they started to be the main hubs: New York, Chicago, the big cities, mostly on the East Coast, but it started to sort of like seep over to the West Coast a little bit later, in the rise of classic Hollywood in the early 50s.
I did want to mention that, hey, it started to enter that mainstream culture a lot more. And I think you're right with the radio. That's something I completely missed. The radio just really helped that branch out from New Orleans. So we'll move to the jazz in the 1960s. Did this idea of it, being music just to feel good, social music, did that change any in this time period, or did we stay the same?
The 50s. We can't skip the 50s.
Okay, my bad. We'll go back. We'll go to the 50s. So how did that change? Did it stay the same?
This is one of the first iterations of jazz that is sort of in keeping with the dichotomy between popular music and our parents' music. So generationally speaking, the new generation doesn't want to listen to what their parents were listening to. So the kids that were growing up in the 50s, they didn't want any of that big band jazz. They didn't want any of that. It's old music. I don't want to listen to that. It's for old people. And so what became popular on the radio in the 50s was the rise of the crooners. And this is one of the cool places in jazz history where jazz and pop sort of start to be parallel. So if you listen to the music of the crooners were being backed up by major bands, like the guys that were in the Miller Band were backing Frank Sinatra. The guys that were in the Ellington Band were backing all of these artists that were crooning. They were singing beautiful ballads about love and sexy time and cigarettes and whiskey. And if you, like I said, if you go back and you listen to those recordings, it's so funny that this is happening today, because we actually just covered this in the jazz ensemble in our rehearsal on Monday. We're doing some Frank Sinatra, and the band that backed, or that was the backing band at the Sands, I mean, that was a who's who of everybody that was in road bands in the late 40s, you know, in the road big bands.
Yeah.
And so the backing music for that entire album swings so hard. But here's where the irony lies. All the kids are like, I don't want to listen to my parents' music. It's for old people. Newsflash, kids, you're listening to your parents' music. It's just being fronted by someone very sexy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like, one of my teachers at IU always used to say that jazz is a perpetual pouring of old wine into new bottles, and the 50s are probably one of the most prominent places where we see the old wine of the big band jazz being poured into the new bottle of crooner, like front man.
I think that's a really good analogy for the music. That's really good.
Oh, totally. He nailed it. I mean, so Pat Harbison, for anybody who's listening, Pat Harbison does this great podcast. I don't know how public it is yet, but there are some of us that have been essentially listening to this masterclass online for some time. And he goes through the entire, down to the detail, down to the notes version of jazz history. So if you're interested in jazz, go check it out. I think it's going to be public here pretty soon. So you know, take a look out for it. But yeah, it's his analogy, and it's absolutely true. Every single decade, every single era of the evolution of jazz is old wine, new bottle. So our old wine in this case is big band jazz being poured in the new bottle of crooners and frontmen. You know, and these singers were, well, okay, you also have to take into consideration the cultural ramifications of men coming back from war and women running the house, and essentially being the sole spenders of the money. The men were making the money, but the women were spending the money. So if you wanted women to buy things, how do you get women to buy things? Oh, make it very sexy, make them very, you know, interested in this handsome man who's selling it. So if you look at all the ads from the 50s for cigarettes and housekeeping, you know, supplies and this and that, I mean, Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, even Sammy Davis was selling stuff, you know, that's more late 50s. But you know what I mean? Like, and that right there, like a person of color being featured in commercials was like, oh, what? No way. It was a big idea and it was very dangerous. But, you know, commercialism of the 50s definitely had an influence on the way music was being marketed and what music was being used for. And consumed essentially by its audience. And of course, at this time, we still have radio. You know, radio is still, it's not quite king because we're starting to go into the television era, right? But you know, we're sort of on equal footing with television, because television at this point is still in its infancy. Another dynamic addition to jazz music in general is electrified instruments, which is another reason we can't skip the 50s, because if it wasn't for the 50s, we would not have electric guitar, we would not have electric organ, and those two instruments right there, in addition to, you know, the Victrolas and being able to play your own records at home and all that fun stuff. Those were all really important foundational growth, right, the growth and perpetuation of jazz, but pop music in general. Like I said, this is the first parallel association of jazz and pop music. These two paths diverged in the 60s. So we think of 1957 as being this great breaking year in jazz history, because it's one of the most obvious marks on sort of the jazz timeline between jazz and pop. That's when they sort of started being different things. So Miles Davis kind of blew, and we have John Coltrane just like tearing things, like John Coltrane played for everybody.
John Coltrane being John Coltrane.
John Coltrane being John Coltrane. If I named his albums, I would be here like forever. But what those artists did, and again, think about it, and then the other side of pop music was artists not of color playing music that is based in jazz, but is now not jazz.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So this is the place where the two paths diverge in the wood, and jazz becomes its own very different thing than pop music. And it also comes with it a counterculture. So the people that are listening to jazz are not the people who are listening to Elvis. They are not the people who are listening to the Beatles. They are the subversive, taboo, dangerous folk that, you know, want the music to make them think. And that's something that people misunderstand about bebop. Now, if I'm being perfectly frank, bebop is hard for me to even listen to because it is so complex. There are many people, many lay people, I don't want to say musicians because I think musicians really get it, but there are many lay people that listen to bebop and go, oh, well, it's just noise. And that was the prevailing opinion in the 50s, the late 50s, early 60s. Oh, well, that jazz music, it's just noise. Ironically, they said the same thing about rock and roll. Isn't that interesting? Yeah. So old wine, new bottle, but maybe new vintage of wine. It's kind of the same thing, born of the same roots. So what made bebop so terribly complex and hard to listen to was that it's very harmonically dense.
Yes.
Right. So in our Western music canon, we talk a lot about like, oh, well, this is the progression that is used for this, and this is a perfect authentic cadence, and this is a this thing, and it's all very predictable. Jazz is that predictable. Bebop is that predictable. The problem for most people is that jazz is that predictable in a split second, where we had prior to this, 100 years prior, a nice 3-minute progression from our area of tonic to our new key area to our 2-5 or 4-5-1, and we're home again. This feels very safe. Bebop is not safe. Bebop does 2-5-1s every 4 beats.
Yes, it's very condensed.
Yeah. Every measure, every 2 measures is a 2-5-1. Again, my Pat Harbison over at IU, he used to call these progressions daisy chains because 2-5-1, 2-5-1, 2-5-1. If you spell the 1 in minor, you get another 2 chord. So you can go 2-5, 2-5, 2-5, 2-5, 2-5, 2-5 indefinitely, and then never actually reach 1 or go to an alternate key area for a little while, which is why people really had a hard time listening to it. The other purpose of bebop in a social setting is these musicians that had been playing big band jazz for decades, at this point, 3 decades. The format there was you go to the gig, you sit down, you play your tunes. You may or may not have music, depending on whose band you're on and how long you've been on it. And you watch the dancers dance, and they dance, and they're all polite, and everybody has punch and goes home at the end of the night. And it's all like, oh, very nice. Yes. Okay. But that crap gets old when you're an artist. Yeah. And a lot of these musicians were real nasty musicians. And they're like, I'm sick of people not listening to me. I'm sick of people not like giving me an identity and giving me credit for what I am doing, what I am playing. And so bebop was essentially these musicians. It was the result of these musicians getting really, really fed up with not being listened to actively. And so John Coltrane and his friends basically stood up and said, I got a fix for this. I'm going to play music that's so hard to listen to that you can't dance to it, that you have to sit down and actually think about it and be in the present moment with us, and therefore be more active in your place in humanity with us in the moment. And that's why bebop is cool. That's why the folks that were listening to bebop were so much more cerebral, or seemed more cerebral than their friends who may have just been listening to pop, rock and roll, right? Rock and roll is super predictable. It's literally the same chord changes that Paco Bell used in this canon in D. It's the same thing. It's been going on for 300 years. But there is solace in that. People like that. It's predictable. It feels safe. They're still talking about sexy things. They're just doing it in a nice, polite way. But bebop was not that. Bebop was overtly ostracizing to a lot of people. Like, nope, we're gonna make you uncomfortable and you're gonna like it. You know what I mean? So man, jazz in the 60s, there's a great book if you want to check it out, if you want to learn more about jazz in the 60s. It's written by Michael J. Buds, and he delves into all of the different cultural influences that created true jazz in the 60s, like why bebop was so angular, you know, what was going on in society that really perpetuated this need for visceral humanity, as he likes to call it. And it's a great read if you want a little bit more of a deep dive on jazz in the 60s. So the cool thing about jazz history is now there are several paths diverged in a wood. You know, you sort of got your pop rock, you've got your country blues, your R&B really was a thing prior to 1960. I think a lot of people discount maybe the Staple Singers and, you know, our great guitar artists, you know, I'm blanking on her name, Big Mama Thornton. I'm not sure if I'm getting that right. You'll have to Google fact check. But you know, there's these great guitar players that are playing the blues, that are playing blues-based stuff, and that all speaks to us as Americans. You know, when I teach the blues at the collegiate level or any level, I like to make sure that my students know that, you know, the blues is, as jazz is as well, you know, quintessentially American music. We invented the sport, you know. Blues is born of strife and hardship, and it's about that. So to play blues from a place of, look, I'm happy, I'm playing a blues scale, look at me go. You're doing it wrong, kiddo. Go skin your knee and then tell me about it. And then you're playing the blues. You know, like it's a cultural and contextual feeling, the blues.
Yeah, it's a mindset change.
Yeah. You can't just play notes. No, it's not allowed. So I've been talking for a while.
No, you're good. You're good. This is all really good. We'll go ahead and we'll get off history just for the sake of time. We could go a bit more into more modern jazz and all that, but we'll save that for another time.
I'll talk about it all day long if you let me.
We'll move to kind of just some general questions about, you know, collegiate jazz ensemble. So what is like the average composition of a collegiate jazz ensemble? And it kind of is just like a breakdown of it, like who plays in it, I guess, what instruments.
So are you talking about the instrumentation or are you talking about the demographic? Instrumentation. Okay. So big band jazz, it's not even just collegiate jazz. So I just want to preface this by saying that the big band is an established format, just as a string orchestra is an established format, a wind band is an established format. A big band now is an established instrumentation. There are slight variations, and most of that is dependent on either the conductor's preferences or the player availability. I mean, and that's not unlike our wind ensembles and our orchestras too. You know, you may or may not have a harpist. So our version of a harpist is a vibraphonist. You know, like you may or may not need a vibraphonist. So the big band is constructed around a rhythm section, and the rhythm section, it's kind of interesting to look at it in terms of its evolution. The big band in terms of its evolution, I mean, because in the teens and 20s, jazz bands were a small rhythm section and a couple horn players. It was real portable. You can get from gig to gig and not have to spend a ton of money schlepping. And that's the nucleus around which the big band is built. So you got a bass player, you got a drummer, and it's worthy of note that the drum set wasn't actually invented until after, I think, 1927, when we started to really record music more actively. So the drum set as we know it is kind of new comparatively to its counterparts and friends here. They had a bass player. This is big band jazz, by the way. Bass player, drummer, a guitar player, and a pianist, maybe a vibraphonist. And that's pretty much it in the rhythm section. And there are different versions. You know, some people really prefer that tall acoustic bass sound, that hollow sort of warmth. That is very indicative of like the 20s and 30s. Even the 40s, they would have had upright basses. We really didn't see electric bass being used in big band until after 1960. You know, like until the thing actually the turn of the century was not always run by a bass player, but it was sometimes run with a tuba player.
Oh, really?
Sort of coming from that, that military band tradition.
Yeah, military band.
Mostly because at the time the bass couldn't be heard. Like an acoustic bass, we eventually again replaced it with a bass. And similarly for guitar, prior to guitar, we had banjo. Banjo is real percussive, it's real loud, and it still gives you that harmonic structure that you really need in the rhythm section. So that's sort of the nucleus. Our modern nucleus, like I said, uses electric guitar, piano, bass, drums, and then maybe a vibraphonist or organ, or a lot of my big bands are using keyboard and using synth now too. But that's, hard to say what's the norm now because so much changes so fast. But in a typical big band setup, departing from the rhythm section, we have a setup of either 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, and 5 saxophones, or 5 trumpets, 4 trombones, 5 saxophones. And again, that's a conductor preference and also a player availability thing. Like I tend to keep 5 trumpet players in my sections here at ISU because I have the trumpet players do it. But it also helps in terms of like distribution of workload. Big band charts are really demanding. It's chamber music. Everybody's one on a part. And for brass players, that's like, oh, my face. Oh, no. So I like to keep an extra set of chops around in case somebody needs a little bit of help. And so I keep 5 trumpet players in the trumpet section. Traditionally, though, that 5th trumpet player could have been used either as a high note specialist or as the jazz specialist. They would do all the improvised solos. They would play all the changes. And so there are differing opinions on what a trumpet section should really look like, but the charts, the actual music reflects that. Different band leaders had different preferences and availability of players with different aptitudes. So there really isn't a standard setup other than that there will be either 4 or 5 trumpets, and those trumpets in a more modern sense can and do double on flugelhorn. It's expected, like if you're going to play big band jazz, you need to own a flugelhorn, have a flugelhorn, be able to play a flugelhorn. Moving on to the trombone section, it's constructed similarly to the trumpet section, but there are rarely ever 5 trombones. It's usually 3 trombones and a bass trombone, or in my band currently, it's 3 trombones and a tuba player because we didn't have a bass trombone player. But those 4th trombone parts, those are real low. Like they're easy for tuba players to play, and it sounds really nice. And I like that timbre too. It doesn't have as much punch as a bass trombone, but you get all the low end you could possibly ask for by hiring a tuba player. And then the saxophone section is 5 saxophonists deep. There are 2 altos, 2 tenors, and a bari. Back in the day, around the 30s, you might have seen parts written for bass sax rather than bari sax. It was novelty, bass saxophone, it's so cool. It's plays so low. But from an orchestration standpoint, it's a real bear.
Yes.
And then similarly in the doubling for the saxophone section, most saxophonists, if they're playing in big bands, can double on flute and clarinet. If you're an alto player, you double on flute and clarinet. If you're a tenor player, you can double on flute and bass clarinet a lot of the time. And then if you play bari, you might actually be asked to play bass clarinet or contrabass clarinet, but that's more rare. Like it's really kind of like a real specific ask if you're playing contrabass in a big band. Like I can't actually think of any pieces off the top of my head that call for it. I just know that I've seen it. So that's the typical format of the sort of the modern big band, whether it's collegiate, professional, or otherwise. And then you may or may not add singers. So singers, like I said, they were an advent of the 50s. Having a singer out front of a big band was very flashy and very cool. And so we do feature singers, but we feature them from within the band at this college. But there are several schools across the United States that will actually audition singers in addition to their big band, and they are members of the big band that come to all the rehearsals and
like a dedicated.
They are dedicated role. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And in fact, the Glenn Miller Band. Part of where that tradition comes from in terms of the big band rep, the Glenn Miller Band had a regular roster of four lady singers or SATB. that would travel with the band and do vocal features. So, you know, the notion that big band is purely instrumental is a little bit heavy-handed, I think. But here at ISU, we're lucky. We have a lot of people who, you know, wear a lot of hats. And so we feature singers from within the band, as, you know, as well as, I mean, we've had singers come from outside the band too.
Yeah.
But it's just an availability thing.
Yeah. All right. Hey, now here's a loaded question. It's a hard one. But what are like a few of the challenges of playing in a jazz ensemble of like? And I know this has like a million different correct answers, but just some of them that come to mind.
For the player, for the conductor, like maybe a little bit more specific?
We'll start with the player.
Okay. So if we're talking about collegiate level big band, the first thing is this notion of chamber music. It's hard when you're a young musician to play really independently, but then to play independently and confidently is a whole different ball of wax. And so I find, whether it's, you know, upper level high school or collegiate big band, young collegiate big band, one of my greatest challenges as a conductor is to get these players to play out. Something that not everyone really thinks about when they think about big band music in the historic sense is that we didn't have microphones for a really long time. Yes. You know, so all of our dynamics were balanced from within the ensemble, just like you would with a wind band or an orchestra. But fortes are probably 200% louder on a big band than they would be a concert band or an orchestra. And it's a numbers game. There are only 22 of you ever. Yeah. You know, like it's a set instrumentation. You don't double any parts in a big band. So the workload when it comes to the individual is much more intense, much more intense. What I love about the players at ISU actually is because they have these very specific ensemble experiences prior to being in the big band. These players play softer with better tone than anybody I've ever coached. I'm like, oh, we can do some Ellington and get like real delicate up in here, which is an asset. You know, that's something that big bands aren't really known for, is playing soft. So that's really cool that these players can do that. So that being said, though, the dynamic contrast of a big band is another challenge for those players, because again, individual players, individual parts. The thing that's challenging for the player in a smaller collegiate setting is the improvising. You know, there might not be a lot of players in the band that are even comfortable doing it. Some folks had maybe never ever been asked to improvise at all. And so as the professor, as the teacher, it's important to like create learning experiences which allow players to make some mistakes or test some stuff out to see what works, and then do a lot of sort of peripheral education on what improvising is, how it works, and how you can do it to a degree that is musical, that is usable, and that you can feel confident and good about. So those are just a couple of the challenges, the more prominent challenges, I think, both for player and conductor.
I'll touch on the part you talked about, inner parts, chamber music, and then we'll get to improv, because I have some questions about that as well. And I think that's another huge part. But I think you're really right with you need really strong inner parts like tenor 2, alto 2, all the lower trumpets. And I think when people see that, they don't have the melody, they don't have the the loud memorable part, they don't play as loud, but it's so important to bring that out, because that's really what makes that separates good jazz ensembles from great jazz ensembles, because
absolutely
all the charts have such dense, rich harmonies. There's so many cool color notes, but you don't hear that unless everyone is just locked solid on their part, very confident that they. So I just wanted, that's a really good point. I wanted to touch on that, and we'll get to improv. So what are kind of some of the basics for solo and improving? Just kind of basic ideas that you can use in an improv solo and stuff like that.
So one of the things that I like to bring to light for young players is that it's not about playing lots and lots of notes. Like, yes, John Coltrane played lots and lots of notes, but that is the equivalent. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, that is the equivalent of drinking like 15 cups of coffee, picking your favorite subject, and then attacking your best friend in the hallway and being like, I'm going to tell you all about the thing that just happened, and look at the and this like word vomiting all over them. So that's like, and I mean, I think I can almost hear how tense you just got with me describing that. Like, that's not a pleasant experience. No one wants to listen to that. So when I teach improvising, I try to come at it from a linguistic perspective. Like, it's not about playing a million notes. It's about playing a few notes that mean something, that say something.
They're telling a story almost.
Exactly. You should tell a story. You should tell me about your day. Tell me about that nice person that you met today, or like that very sweet person that bought you coffee today and how wonderful they are. Like those are the stories we like to hear about. Now, what notes do I play though? How do I do that? Start simple. I try to tell everybody, start simple, start simple, start simple. When we're learning our language, when we're learning what works for us on our instrument, it's important to just start simple, start really basic. A lot of people, when they get into a big band in college, they've never seen changes before. They've never seen chord changes. And so they don't even know what they're looking at. You know, like when they see C7, they're like, does that have a B natural in it? No, it doesn't. Because unless it says C major 7, it doesn't have a major 7. So some of these things you sort of learn as you go along. But as far as right notes and wrong notes, I feel like that's a little bit of a misnomer. There are no wrong notes if you resolve them properly. Like, yes, you can land.
I like that.
I'm serious. I am absolutely serious. If you resolve a half step in either direction, you will resolve. And it'll sound cool. It'll sound really intentional. You know, you can land on something that's very dissonant. You can land on a major 7th. You can land on an 11 or a sharp 11. And as long as you resolve it in the direction where it feels it needs to go, then you're fine. But it's learning about, okay, wait a minute. So that's a sharp 11. So it resolves down. Well, no, it's a sharp 11. It's not a flat 5. So it has a little bit different journey in life, you know, and it's learning about what the note tendencies are and how they should move.
Learning where notes resolve to. Yeah,
exactly. Believe it or not, I mean, and I've had a couple of trumpet students ask me about this and study this with me. They're like, oh my God, I know more about music theory by studying jazz like changes than I think I've ever really learned in a skills class, you know. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's functional, it's applied. Now you understand why these voices need to do this thing rather than just learning these voices need to do this thing. So that's one of the great aspects of teaching jazz at the collegiate level, is it really drives home all of these theoretical principles that you're already learning in your theory and your skills courses. So improvising is, notes and scales and patterns that are put together to convey an emotion or feeling. And so a lot of people, when I explain it that way, you can just see the light bulb go on and go, wait a minute, it's not super complicated? No, it's not super complicated. So I hope that answers your question about improvising in the teaching.
Yeah, that was great. That was great.
Okay.
I really like thinking of it linguistically. I think that's a really good point. I like, simple solos to start. I think that was all really good. So we'll move to kind of just teaching jazz and some more miscellaneous questions to kind of wrap things up. But so as a jazz educator, what are like just some of the day-to-day decisions you make, and what's your teaching philosophy for it? Which I know, really hard question, but
it's a big question. It's a big question.
Yeah.
So jazz education, if you think about it in the grand sense, is still somewhat in its infancy. It's a little bit in its toddlerhood now, that there are a lot more people doing this at the collegiate level, at the high school level. So, there's a lot of uncharted territory about jazz in the academic setting. But some of the things that shape my personal philosophy about the teaching of jazz in an educational setting is really, like, especially in a teaching college where, primarily the membership of my ensemble, they're going to be music teachers someday.
Yeah.
So what I try to bring to their attention within our rehearsals are things like historical context. Why is this music this way? What was it used for? And why should we bring out this aspect versus that aspect of the music for our students? And what will that ultimately mean for them? But also, this notion that it needs to also be a safe place, which is so like anti-jazz. I get it, but the jazz ensemble, in comparison to many wind ensembles and orchestras, has sort of implicit permission to be a little wild.
Yeah.
And that right there is so scary for people. They're like, wait a minute, every single thing I do is not prescribed by a conductor or a piece of paper. And it's like, no, you can be creative in here, and you can be an individual in here, and you can explore
a lot
the
more
things
experimentation that you're allowed to do. Because, you know, like in classical music, you can't start putting turns and bending different notes, because, you know, that's a great way to get yelled at. But in jazz, you know, in jazz, you can, you know, there's a lot more freedom. I think that's a really good point.
Individual, and therefore it becomes more of a team sport, you know what I mean? Like so it's an exciting chance for a lot of students to take some risks that they wouldn't be able to take in other ensembles, and to do it in a way that is like, oh, that was really cool. Well, what was really cool about that? Oh, well, that made this seem this way, or this was, you know, this felt different because you did this a different way. And learning about their own capabilities as individuals and how that can affect their sections and then the overall sound of the band is so important, both for the perpetuation of the art, because jazz is an organic language that is always changing. So you have to allow it to change. You have to allow it to be organic and flowing. And then the other thing is their first person observations of minute changes from their perspective, and then bringing to their attention the macro changes, which are a result of the micro changes that they are making on the individual level. So I try to bring that to light as much as I can, especially for the music educators in the room. Like, oh, look at that. You bent this one note. Now the whole section is bending that note. Now, doesn't that swing a little harder? Doesn't that feel a little better?
Yeah.
And it's sometimes it's just that simple. It's just like one little difference in the way you're expressing a particular line or phrase that can make all the difference in the way the entire ensemble feels. I actually just talked about this yesterday with the saxophone section in the big band. We're doing Frank Sinatra. We're doing I've Got You Under My Skin, and there's this really swinging backing figure behind the bridge, and it's behind. I tried everything, come what might, for the sake of having you near. Now that melody is very on the beat, right? Da 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 ba da 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 da. Well, what the saxophones are doing are they're outlining the melody, and then they're playing against it. There's this cool counterpoint. So they go da 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 da. And they sort of move the harmony forward with all of these ands, with all this syncopation. I mean, there are few big band charts that can swing quarter notes that hard.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, we don't often think of quarter notes as swinging. And when I bring that to the attention of an ensemble, they're just like, what? Quarter notes can swing? And it's like, oh yes. Oh yes. If you subdivide and you place that quarter note just right, just in the pocket, it'll swing real hard. And so we did a little bit of experimentation with that, you know, altering the drum groove just slightly, and really listening to how the melody and the backing figures fit together, that counterpoint. And it was like a whole new band. It was like having the Sinatra at the Sands band in the room, and you could just feel it. And that's another thing that I think is really, really important. And I feel like not everyone gets to feel this way, because jazz is its own unique thing, but there's a certain little sparkle, there's a certain little magic in the air when everybody kind of clicks together, and we all all the light bulbs go on at once, and we're like, oh, this is what this is supposed to sound like. Oh my gosh. You know, it's very exciting. And I think that's a really important aspect of teaching jazz at any level, to help students get to that point where they really feel like, wow, I'm playing this authentically. Wow, I'm playing this really well, and it sounds really good, and it's very musical, and that we can all be in that moment together. Because again, ultimately, jazz is about the human experience. Jazz is about that elation, that musical ecstasy that, you know, is so rare, especially now, because live music is, you know, not as prevalent as it once was. But having those experiences available for students is going to help them, one, become better musicians, two, become better jazz musicians, or at least more curious about jazz, and three, know a little bit more of how to teach it in an organic and authentic way that gives credit to the greats that made this music. You know, we really are a historic ensemble now. Jazz is 100 years old as of a couple of years ago. And so we would be doing it a disservice if we didn't consider those aspects when we teach it.
Yeah. All right. And then this is some really good points. That was all really good.
I try.
So I know you've done a bit of arranging for jazz ensemble. So can you explain kind of your process for arranging charts?
Sure. Most of the time when I arrange a chart, I'm inspired by it in some way. Either I really like some of the melodies, or I can hear within the original version, like how it would translate to big band. And so I find a little spark of excitement and going, ooh, I bet you I could do this thing and it would sound cool. So I'm kind of a kid in a candy shop when it comes to that sort of thing. But my process in arranging something was actually sort of taught to me many, many years ago in the context of marching band, believe it or not. I started to get my arranging chops together, arranging for marching bands. And my teacher that I studied with, Dr. Steve Grugan at Northern Michigan University, the first step for him, well, that he taught me was, really the first step was to listen to the construction of the melody versus the harmony, and listen to what voice, soprano, alto, tenor, bass, it really lends itself to. And then making just that right decision as to who should have the melody when can really make or break a chart. So when I listen to something that I want to arrange, like, recently I did an arrangement of Impossible Year for, which was Panic at the Disco, that has nothing to do with big band. I knew that because that was such a dynamic vocal chart that I wanted to keep it a vocal chart. So I didn't want to put that melody in the horns at all, except for the part where it gets a little dicey. So if you listen to the arrangement critically, you'll notice that at the highest point of the vocals, there's never air to breathe, there's never in betweens, the nightmare always hangs on past the dream. That's the hardest part for a man to sing. That's hard for me to sing. I'm an alto. But knowing that that's the case, I also try to write charts that support the soloist or support the section that's doing the work. You'll notice that in the orchestration of that, the saxophones double that melody in octaves with the vocalist. So they could choose to sing the written vocal line, or they could sing something else because the saxophones have what the recording did. They have the thing that people know. So there's a little creative, like smoke and mirrors kind of stuff in my writing. I also try to include idioms that make the players feel good, like brass players really like stacking things. We really like fanfare figures. We really like it when the harmony builds on itself, and that, we can crescendo and decrescendo sort of as a team. Those are things that are easy for us to do and that we have a good knowledge of. And in a big band, 2/3 of your horns are brass players. When I write for woodwinds, I try to make it so it's not terribly boring, because your instrument is so fluid, and your instrument is so flexible and able to play very exciting lines and stuff. That doesn't mean I write them all the time, but I do make sure that I write just a few real tasty little things in there to just sort of nod and go, I see you, woodwinds. I see you. I hear you. And one thing that I think that the woodwind choirs do really, really well, and I give mad props to Dr. Bro, because every saxophone section that I've coached here has been phenomenal in this regard. They have this incredible vocal quality to their dynamic contrast and their function as a small ensemble within a large ensemble. So you have 5 saxophones, it's a saxophone quintet inside of this giant behemoth that is the big band. And they really play those parts that way. So when I write for this saxophone section, I like to write them somewhat homogeneously. where they're doing, they might be playing really dense harmony, but they're essentially, playing the same rhythms or similar rhythms, so that they can kind of feel like they're organically a team, an ensemble within an ensemble. And historically, that's how that was done. Every horn section is regarded as its own choir: trumpet choir, trombone choir, saxophone choir. So if you go back and you listen to jazz from, the 40s and 50s, you'll hear these fantastic saxophone solos, and they get even wilder in the 80s. Like, you want to hear some serious saxophone work? Listen, Stan Kenton Band, 1976 through 86. Like the just nasty saxophone. It's so good. But again, you have to write in a way that's idiomatic for the instrument. Like, I would never in a million years write that many 16th notes for brass players. It'll never translate unless you're working with pros. I mean, you can write that stuff for pros and they'll do it, but they won't like it, because that's not what we do.
Yeah.
We do like fat, huge, punchy, loud.
It's not playing to your strengths.
Exactly. So I write to the player's strengths on an individual level, but also in a more general and idiomatic way as well. I will say my weakest point of my writing is always my rhythm section writing, because I'm not a real rhythm section player. I play enough piano to get by, and that's all she wrote. So, I often look to my rhythm sections as collaborative partners. The rhythm section writing is more descriptive than prescriptive. And so much of it is dependent on the experience of the individual players themselves. With a minimal coaching, I can help a rhythm section sound really good if I write them general stuff, and especially when you give reference recordings, that helps them a lot too. So that's basically my process. Is I write from the top down. I write from the melody down, not necessarily the rhythm section up. But along the way, I sort of take little departures into the woods and go, ooh, what if I did this cool little saxophone choir thing here and have that, sort of outlined by the trombones. The trombones are honestly the hardest section in the big band to write for, because they're everything. They're tenor voices, they're soprano voices, they're bass voices. Their functionality is usually within the middle of the harmony. No one notices them unless you give them something very high and very hard, and they don't want to do that, so that's probably one of the most challenging things about writing for the big band, is just what the heck do you do with the trombones?
yeah
So the short answer is creative doubling and harmonic structure. In case anyone wanted to know.
Are there, any concluding thoughts you have about, anything you wanted to plug, just anything in general?
Well, I mean, we have a concert April 30th day at the Terre Haute Brewing Company. We start playing at 8 and we don't stop until 10. We might actually go over. It's going to be a whole thing. Got some guest artists coming in. Pat Harbison, the wine and new bottles guy. He's going to be there. He's our guest artist. And it's going to be a great time. We've got some vocal numbers put on. This band is now playing 2 straight hours of music. I am so proud of them. So proud of them. They've come so far and they're swinging really hard. I think it's going to be a really enjoyable musical experience for everybody. And of course, we're going to observe all the COVID protocols, cap the room at 50. But, we hope that the first 50 people in the door really enjoy it. So we hope to see everybody there. And thanks for having me. This was so fun.
This was good. All right. Well, that concludes our final episode.